Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the third weekend of July 2024. I'm your host, Chris Krug. The Center Square and the Radio Hour are projects of the Franklin News Foundation, a 501c3 independent nonprofit, nonpartisan news service. Established in 2019, the Center Square Newswire publishes original taxpayer-centric straight news that focuses on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Center Square Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories, adding insight to the headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Dibangi, PhD economist, and bring you the latest in K-12 education news from our Franklin News Foundation's Chalkboard News team. Today, we'll discuss the assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania. We'll hear about the exit of yet another significant company from California. And we'll review the headlines from the Republican National Convention this week. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
Are you tired of news that puts politics over people? At the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation, we believe in putting people over politics by delivering nonpartisan news and audio content that serves you, the American taxpayer. With Franklin News Foundation, you can read fact-based, state-focused news for free at thecentersquare.com. You can listen to civil, balanced conversations between policy experts through our podcast network at americastalking.com. Or you can get in-depth news on K-12 education spending, curriculum, and school safety at chalkboardnews.com. It's all free through Franklin, where we put you, the American taxpayer, first in every story, episode, and conversation. And it's only possible through our supporters. Together, we can produce content that puts people over politics and brings Americans the news they deserve. Become a supporter today at franklinnews.org/donate. Once again, that's franklinnews.org/donate.
He ran for state office and was beaten. Started a business and failed. Ran for Congress and lost. But thankfully, Abraham Lincoln didn't give up. Persistence. Pass it on. From the Foundation for a Better Life at values.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on the assassination attempt on former President Trump and the developments that have unfolded this week is our Dan McCaleb.
It has been an historic, nearly tragic, and completely surreal week in presidential election news. Former President Donald Trump survived an assassination attempt at a campaign rally in Pennsylvania. The head of the Secret Service faces outrage and increasing pressure to resign because of the failed security efforts at that rally. And President Joe Biden is facing increased calls from top officials in his own party to exit the presidential race, with some media outlets reporting he could make a decision as early as this weekend. Despite all of this, Trump participated daily at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, and he officially accepted the GOP nomination for president. We will discuss the Republican convention and other presidential election news in a separate segment, but joining me now to discuss all aspects of the failed attempt to assassinate Donald Trump is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. bureau chief for the Center Square. Casey, let's focus on the shooting and its aftermath. Tell us more about the security blunders and where we are at with the investigation into the Secret Service.
We're at the beginning of what I suspect will be a very long and very thorough investigation of the Secret Service, a federal security group that has been thrown into controversy, chaos, and even public feuding with local law enforcement. I mean, there's a lot of angles to hit this from, Dan. We interviewed at thecentersquare.com a former head of the Secret Service and really the guy who helped found the TSA as well. So he knows what he's talking about. And he just, raised some serious concerns. And those are concerns that a lot of people are talking about. For instance, how could this shooter get on a roof that was only about 130 yards from the former President Donald Trump? 130 yards in shooting is a pretty short distance. You don't have to be a military level sniper to make that shot. Often perimeters will go up to, maybe 500 yards or something. So 130 is really a pretty deep penetration into the perimeter. He was there for so long. The more, Dan, I'm sure you've seen, but there's increasing reports coming out that maybe the Secret Service had already identified this guy as a person of interest, that maybe a police officer had actually encountered him and then backed down. We've seen these online viral, videos where many attendees at the rally are pointing out the shooter to law enforcement before the shooting happened. right? And so there's a lot of big questions here. Thankfully, the president is safe. He's doing fine. Of course, his ear is bandaged, and we'll see, just how gnarly that ends up being. But he is safe, and the Secret Service has a lot of questions to answer.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about the video from rally goers. These are private citizens, presumably mostly on camera phones, videotaping the suspect in the case, Thomas Matthew Crooks, walking around just outside of the perimeter as much as an hour before the rally began. And then there's video of attendees recording the shooter crawling on the rooftop, just barely from where Trump took the stage. And then the Secret Service coming out and saying we didn't have anybody on that roof because it was a sloped roof and unsafe. U.S. Secret Service Director Kimberly Cheadle, who many are calling to resign, she's got a lot of questions to answer.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people are calling for her to resign. Senators, Elon Musk, who, immediately endorsed Donald Trump. He shared that same sentiment, which has been widely shared. I don't think she's going to make it. DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas did publicly defend her initially at the White House briefing, but the more time that goes on, the more questions there are. I mean, the idea that a roof of that slope would not be safe is kind of silly when you see it and you see the shooter on it. It's not safe, Dan, is snipers.
Yeah.
It's not safe. Right. So she's facing a lot of calls. It's been interesting to see that the Secret Service has tried to push the blame off on local law enforcement and say, well, the local law enforcement was responsible for the outer perimeter and Secret Service was responsible for the inner perimeter, the close protection. And, the sources we talked to did confirm that usually the way Secret Service operates is they will be in charge of the close perimeter, and then the softer, more outer perimeter can be delegated to local law enforcement. But ultimately, Secret Service is in charge of where officers are stationed, what they do, how they communicate. There's no local law enforcement making decisions about that. They're just standing where they're told to stand. They're holding their spot, and Secret Service is definitely in charge of the operation. There's no question about that. And so, local law enforcement and even the National, Fraternal Order of Police has pushed back hard and publicly called out to the Secret Service and said, you cannot blame local law enforcement for this. These guys did their best. They reacted when the shooting happened. It's the Secret Service who is in charge of setting up the perimeter, of saying who's on what buildings, seeing who's on, what line of sights. That's the person to blame. So, I think they're trying to deflect here, but it doesn't look good. And I think Cheadle's days are numbered.
Cheadle's been subpoenaed to appear before Congress next week. We'll see if that happens. There's also questions, Casey, about whether diversity, equity, and inclusion policies within the Biden administration, whether that's led to fewer quality employees being hired. We saw a few of the Secret Service agencies who, let me say this, heroically, as soon as the shots were fired, got on the stage to protect Trump. But some of them were like 5 feet tall, and President Trump is a tall man, that they couldn't even protect his head and upper body just because of their height. That doesn't seem to me to be a smart decision there.
Yeah, I mean, I've met the president. I get to interview him in the White House during his first term, and it may not be apparent on camera, but he's kind of a huge person. He's, I think, about 6'3". He's very broad. He's towering. When he's in the room, he's the biggest person in the room. He's the tallest person. He kind of stoops down to speak to people because he is tall. And so that's just it's just like one of the first things you notice about him when you see him in person, how tall he is. And so the idea that you would have a 5'4" woman or some of these, whoever it is, it's drawn a lot of criticism. Cheadle has made DEI hiring a big priority for her, in her tenure. And I think a lot of people feel afraid to ask those kind of questions or criticize it or don't want to be seen as being kind of associated with a certain type of person who makes a big deal about those kinds of things. But it was just very apparent when you saw the video, when you saw someone half Trump size trying to cover his body. And I think her head was like below his heart. Yeah. If you look at the photo, I mean, that's the main thing you need to cover is his heart, and her head was kind of bent down below, maybe right on his heart or right below his heart. So it was just kind of a striking image of this drift towards DEI. It was so serious that it gave people who are normally silent permission to criticize DEI hiring. But that DEI hiring is widespread all throughout the federal government. But maybe on some of these extremely important positions. I mean, hey, I think if they find a 6'4" woman, put her out there. That's great. I don't think it's really about the gender, but the size. You can't be small guarding the president, in my opinion.
Thank you for joining us today, KC listeners can keep up with this developing story and more at thecentersquare.com.
A big thanks to Dan and Casey. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on Elon Musk's announcement that both SpaceX and the social media platform X will be leaving California is our Eliana Kernodle.
After Governor Gavin Newsom signed a bill banning parental notification for gender change requests at K-12 schools, Elon Musk announced he is moving SpaceX and X out of the state. Joining me to tell us more is Kenneth Schrupp, California reporter for the Center Square. Kenneth, what is motivating Musk here?
For Musk, it seems that this is based on both the business climate and a lot of the cultural laws that California is passing. Cal Matters reporter Alexei Koseff noted that this comes out about 2 years after Musk's transgender daughter cut ties with him after attending a school in Los Angeles, and 17 months after Newsom appeared with Musk to announce the opening of a Tesla engineering headquarters in Silicon Valley, during which point they probably had some kind of conversation. Elon Musk, in his post on X announcing the move, said, "This is the final straw. Because of this law and many others that preceded it, attacking both families and companies, SpaceX will now move its HQ from Hawthorne, California to Starbase, Texas. I did make it clear to Newsom about a year ago that laws of this nature would force families and companies to leave California to protect their children." About 20 minutes after that tweet, Musk announced he's also moving the headquarters of X to Texas as well.
Can you tell us more about this bill that Newsom signed that initiated this response?
Yes, AB 1955 is a bill that bans school districts from adopting policies that require parents to be notified if a child wishes to go by a different name, use facilities or programs that are sex segregated but of a different gender. For example, use another restroom or play on a different team. This was presented as a bill that would stop forced outings. About a year ago, California's Department of Education adopted guidance on its website and an FAQ telling schools that they should not disclose children's gender-related record change requests to parents. After the California Department of Education issued this, school districts passed rules requiring schools notify their children request to change their pronouns, go by a substantially different name, or use those gendered facilities and programs for children of the opposite gender. California Attorney General Rob Bonta supported lawsuits against these school districts, the first of which to adopt this policy was Chino Valley Unified School District. So Chino Valley's policy required parents to be notified within 3 days if a student is involved in violence, talks about suicide, or requests to identify with or participate in programs or use school facilities that are for gender different from what is on their birth certificate or official records. So there was a lawsuit in the state court level in which the state court issued a preliminary injunction against some parts of the policy, but allowed other parts of the policy to go forward. A preliminary injunction just means that a policy or a law is going to be on hold until a full trial can be held. So the preliminary injunction ruled that the clauses on notifications for requests to be treated as the other gender or use sex-segregated programs, that would be on hold until a full trial could be held. But that its policy requiring notification to parents for if a child wants to change their official or unofficial records, that could keep moving forward. So Chino, they updated their policy in March to reflect the preliminary injunction. That ends up leaving this case in limbo because there's nothing for the state to really sue against. Because if the judge decides that this one part of the policy doesn't need an injunction because it doesn't seem like the state is going to win on that, it doesn't make any sense for this lawsuit to really continue because it does seem like the state courts would uphold the part of the policy that is still continuing and was amended to include just that.
And so now the governor has signed this bill that sort of puts into law what had already been part of the practice of the education department. And now that it's been put into law, the same school district, Chino, is bringing a lawsuit against them. Can you tell us more about it?
Yes. Chino Valley and parents of California public school students have filed a lawsuit, again, with the Liberty Justice Center, who's been representing Chino in this, but in federal court instead of state court. They are claiming that this ban is unconstitutional under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, saying the state is depriving parents of their right to make decisions about the care, custody, and control of their children. They're also making a First Amendment claim that religious parents' beliefs are violated by the ban, and a third claim that this is in violation of the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, which requires schools that receive federal funds to guarantee parent access to student education records. Now, this bill didn't have an urgency clause, so it does not take effect until January 1st, which means that it might take some months before a federal district court looks at and reviews this case. But it's important to see that this is in federal court, not state court, because first of all, it can affect a much larger geographic area than just California. And also, if the Chino Valley School District does not win, there are several levels of appeal. They can appeal to the Ninth Circuit Court. And if that doesn't go in their favor, they can appeal to the Supreme Court.
Well, I'm sure we will continue to follow this story as it goes forward, both in this lawsuit and also in seeing the impacts of a couple big businesses leaving California. Thank you for your insights on these stories, Kenneth. Listeners can keep up with these stories and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Kenneth. You've been listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Back with a review of the RNC from Milwaukee is Dan McCaleb.
Former President Donald Trump officially accepted the Republican nomination for president Thursday night in Milwaukee, just days after surviving an assassination attempt on his life at a campaign rally in Butler, Pennsylvania. Earlier in the week, he named conservative U.S. Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio as his vice presidential running mate. The drama around the Republican National Convention unfolded as top Democratic leaders increasingly called for President Joe Biden to end his candidacy to allow Vice President Kamala Harris or another Democrat to replace him ahead of next month's Democratic convention in Chicago. Joining me to discuss all of this week's developing news is Casey Harper, the Center Square's Washington, D.C. bureau chief. Casey, you covered Trump's speech last night. Let's start there. What are your takeaways?
I mean, it was a pretty sort of magical moment in politics. The first remarks after the survival of his assassination attempt, we saw a bit of a different Trump, a more serious Trump, a more somber Trump. He described in detail the shooting from his perspective, what it felt like to have the bullet hit the side of his face, how the reaction of the crowd in particular affected him emotionally. He said that, you know, the fact that they didn't run in fear, but supported him, he felt very loved by that. And I found that interesting. He talked about raising his fist to fight and how bloody his hand was, which of course has become an iconic moment, an iconic photo. And many people, even people that I personally know and, you know, in the media and on Twitter and elsewhere, talking about that moment where he raised his fist and said, fight, 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 was such a powerful moment, and a moment where they said, oh, I'm going to vote for Trump, even though, which I thought was really interesting, that really sealed the deal for some people. But it's such an interesting time, as you called it, I think earlier, surreal. And I think that's right. We have one candidate, the incumbent president, and there's talks of him resigning possibly in the next few days, even though he's already won the nomination, essentially, being forced out by his own party, while the other is a former president who lost, contested the election, and now running again, facing indictments. But the Supreme Court comes in and says, well, he's partially immune for some of them. And now he survives an assassination attempt, and he's at a rally accepting the thing. So it's just it's a crazy time to be in the media, but just even to be an American. And so I think people are longing for some peace and stability, but I don't think they're going to get it. At least maybe next year, but I don't think that's coming.
Let me clarify one thing on President Biden, not necessarily resigning, but ending his candidacy to run again next year. Let's talk a little bit about the drama leading up to former President Trump's selection of a vice presidential candidate. He finally announced, ended the speculation when he announced that it would be J.D. Vance, U.S. Senator from Ohio. What do you think of the pick?
You know, Vance, I think, is a very smart pick. He's young in a race where one of the main criticisms and talking points is how old the candidates are. So he's young. He's a fresh face, which means he doesn't have the baggage that someone with a longer career in politics will have. He's from Ohio, which is right in the neighborhood of the states that Trump really wants to take away from Biden. You know, Ohio, Pennsylvania in particular, some of these union states in the Midwest, in that area where Biden has a lot of pull, Trump wants to weaken that. In fact, if you remember in 2020 in the election, one of the main reasons the Democrats gathered around Biden, even though he wasn't winning the primary, really, Buttigieg dropped out, Kamala Harris dropped out and rallied behind Biden because they thought Trump could beat Biden they thought Biden could beat Trump because Biden has that appeal to union voters, to working class Midwestern voters. And there's truth in that. And so I think Trump is trying to respond in this kind of chess game by putting Vance out there at the convention. Vance shared his story, which is very compelling. There's a movie on Netflix about him that you can watch about his story. He grew up in a very poor, kind of drug-riddled family that was sort of typical of the experience of a lot of American families in the hollowing out of the Midwest over the last few decades. And so that's a really powerful moment. I think he did pretty good. He's a very softer, gentler version of America First that I think accomplishes the reaching for the Midwest, but he also maybe can be less offensive to suburban women, which is an extremely important demographic in every election now, but especially this one. So he plugged some holes for Trump, and he's also put some intellectual chops to the America First movement, which is often seen as kind of not having the intellectual chops. So he wrote Hillbilly Elegy, which is really showed his Yale side in explaining from a sort of anthropological and demographic view what happened in America to propel Trump to the White House. It was a best-selling book. Of course, the Netflix movie came after it. So he's opposite of Trump in a lot of ways, but shares the messaging. And the question is, Dan, do you think he is the heir apparent to the America First movement? I find that a very interesting question.
That is an interesting question, Casey, but let's set that aside for another day. While the Republican National Convention felt very much like a party, in fact, one of our colleagues said it felt like a rock concert, the Democratic National Convention, which is just a few weeks away in Chicago, it could have a much different feel and tone with widespread speculation that Biden might actually step aside. Where are we at with that?
I mean, we are in by the time people start listening to this segment and by the time they finish it, there might be an update. I mean, that is how fast that story is changing. New developments are coming up constantly. Tons of media reporting that it's imminent that he's going to step down. Now, publicly, the White House has sort of pushed back and denied this, but we don't know what's going on behind the scenes. I think what's really interesting question if he steps down is, does he throw his weight behind Kamala Harris and endorse her, or does he leave it to an open convention and let, Gretchen Whitmer and Gavin Newsom make their bid if they want it? And do they make that bid behind the scenes or publicly at the convention? I mean, if Trump's convention felt like a rock concert, an open convention could feel like a knife fight. I mean, we have not seen anything like that, where the presidency chance to take on Donald Trump is just this. It's like going to be like the Hunger Games, Dan, either publicly or behind the scenes.
Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with this developing story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thanks to Dan and Casey for that update. That'll do it for the first half of the Center Square Radio Hour. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. What are American voters across the country saying in the latest Center Square Voters Voice poll? How is diversity, equity, and inclusion promoted in the federal school district that serves military families? And what's the latest information on the U.S. national debt? All that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Here are this week's quick hits, some of the original reporting you may have missed at thecentersquare.com. Ohio recently launched the Military Recruit Award, offering a $3,000 taxpayer-funded hiring bonus to service members, veterans, and their spouses who work at Ohio schools for at least a year. Governor Mike DeWine emphasized that the program benefits both the military community and students, as service members bring valuable life lessons to the classroom. The state will reimburse districts for their bonuses, and eligible individuals include current and former military members and their spouses, with an additional $1,500 bonus available to the schools that recruit them. In North Carolina, We the People is now an official party. The North Carolina Board of Elections voted on Tuesday. In the same meeting, the board denied access to the Justice for All party. We the People, which supports Robert F. Kennedy Jr. for president, was approved 4-1. Justice for All Party, which supports Cornel West for president, was denied 3-2. The decisions impact each respective party's options to run a candidate for any office in North Carolina, not just for president. New Jersey Democratic Senator Bob Menendez has been found guilty of 16 counts of bribery and other charges in his federal corruption trial. On Tuesday, a New York City jury found the lawmaker guilty of accepting hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes in exchange for wielding his influence to benefit foreign governments and a trio of businessmen. Menendez and his co-defendants, New Jersey businessmen Wael Hannah and Fred Diabies, were accused by federal prosecutors in a bribery scheme from 2018 to 2023 to benefit 3 New Jersey businessmen, including by serving as a foreign agent for the government of Egypt. The senator denied any wrongdoing and accused prosecutors of targeting him. New York Attorney General Letitia James is suing Nassau County over the newly signed law banning transgender female athletes from competing in women's sporting events at county facilities. The lawsuit, which was filed on Monday alongside a similar complaint by the New York chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union, targets a law approved by the Nassau County Legislature in June. That law banned transgender girls and women from competing at county facilities on teams and leagues. The law is similar to an executive order signed by Blakeman in February, which was blocked by a recent court ruling and has been appealed by Blakeman. In Arizona, the Secure the Border Act will make it onto the November ballot for voters after the Maricopa County Superior Court shot down a lawsuit from activist groups challenging its legality. The proposition would make it a crime to cross into Arizona through an illegal point of entry, as well as other provisions to crack down on the high levels of migrant crossings and the fentanyl crisis. The legal argument made by the activist groups is that it violates the Arizona Constitution, which requires propositions only to tackle one topic. But the court ruled that since the provisions all relate to an overall subject matter, it does not violate the law. There were more than 205,000 illegal border crossers apprehended in June, according to new U.S. Customs and Border Protection data released on Monday. June's numbers bring the total number of illegal border crossers this fiscal year to more than 2.4 million. The majority of illegal border crossers were apprehended at the southwest border last month, totaling more than 130,000. Fiscal year to date, more than 1.82 million were apprehended at the southwest border. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Back with more on the Center Square's latest Voters' Voice poll is Eliana Kernodle.
Inflation, immigration, and the economy continue to be top concerns for voters, according to the latest Voters' Voice poll. Joining me to dig into the poll results is the Center Square's Elise Apel. Elise, before we get into the data, can you give us the background on this poll, the resources it's drawing on, and when it was conducted?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Yeah, so it was a poll that was conducted July 8th through 11th. So after the, debate performance, but prior to the assassination attempt on former President Trump. And it was conducted in conjunction with Noble Predictive Insights, which is a polling company. It surveyed nearly 2,300 likely voters. About half of those were Republicans, half were Democrats, but they also had about 200 true, what they call non-leaning independents. In the poll, it's called the Center Square Voters' Voice poll. It's actually only one of 6 national tracking polls in the United States. So it's pretty great that we were able to get this data.
And what are kind of the big concerns it identified across the board for voters?
Yeah, so the top 3 were inflation, illegal immigration, and economy/jobs. So this is really interesting data. It's the same top 3 as the same poll that we conducted back in March. It's the same top 3, but there's a little bit of a flip in that inflation is still very high. So that was the number of people that put inflation as their top concern, inflation and price increases, was 45%. But there was actually a little bit of a flip from the March poll in that 8% less respondents said that illegal immigration was a top concern, and the economy/jobs number went up about 8% as well. So that was really interesting to see that people seem a little bit less concerned about illegal immigration. It's still, something that concerns a lot of people. That was at 36% of people put that as a top concern. But there's actually more concern about the economy and jobs, which is really interesting, especially looking at, as experts are saying that inflation is leveling out, but we do have, kind of an increase in unemployment and all these other numbers. It's really interesting to see that people are definitely still feeling the effects of Biden's economic policies and just the effects of inflation.
And what were kind of some of the differences between Republicans, Democrats, and independents here? Because there's kind of the numbers for the voters overall, but it also kind of breaks down differently when you start looking at the specific.
Right. Yeah. So that was really interesting to look at, because it really did seem like the more you were concerned about inflation and the economy, the more likely you were to vote Republican or lean right, which is super interesting. So on the inflation question, over half of Republicans, 55% of Republicans said that inflation was a great concern for them, but only 37% of Democrats did. I think that's really telling. It's also really telling that those true independents or non-leaning independents, ones that really truly didn't lean either right or left, actually aligned more with Republicans. So they had 44% of independents were more concerned with inflation. And I think that's going to be really telling going into the election. Are they still concerned about the inflation numbers? If so, are they going to vote Republican or are they going to vote Democrat? But yeah, so that was a really interesting breakdown. Another thing to kind of pull out of the poll would be abortion. So many races across the country, a lot of Democrats are running on abortion. Abortion as their kind of key issue, women's health, women's rights as being their kind of talking point issue. And it's actually really interesting to look at that while abortion was in the top 10, so abortion rights was listed as a top concern at 26%, it actually is lower than would be expected for, something that so many people are running on across the country. So many Democrats are running on. Democrats were much more likely to list that as a top concern. It was very low for Republicans.
So with the economy being such a big concern, how does this tie into President Joe Biden's approval ratings?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And I think that is definitely going to play a big factor going into the election in November. Looking at, independents who actually seem to be leaning towards voting for Trump, especially because, another question that we had in the poll was, approval of how Joe Biden is handling the economy. And those independents were actually significantly more likely than Democrats to disapprove of how he's handling the economy. So even though, inflation is down from that 9% that it was at a couple of years ago, it definitely seems to still be affecting the American people. And I think that could be really an issue that Trump and Biden are going to be focusing on going into the election, especially former President Trump. I think he's going to be focusing on, how are people feeling about gas prices, about grocery store prices, because people are still really feeling that in their wallet, even if the experts are saying, oh, we're doing fine, inflation is going down, everything's looking great. People are still really feeling it in their wallet. And this really came out in the poll. Looking at that, almost, 60% of voters are upset with President Joe Biden's handling of the economy. I think that's going to be really hard for Joe Biden to run on his time as president when over half of voters disapprove of his job with the economy, which is something that is obviously, the top issue for voters going into the election. And looking at kind of the breakdown on that, 56% of voters disapprove of how Biden's handling the economy. That was almost 90% of Republicans. But I think it's actually really interesting that also nearly 60% of independents said that as well. So I think that is going to be really important going into the election.
Well, Elise, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Elise. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the DEI efforts in the federal school district that serves military families, we'll go back to Eliana Kernodle.
A government accountability nonprofit took a look at the government-run school district that serves military families and found it spends significant funds on diversity, equity, and inclusion-related content. Joining me to discuss this is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, tell us about this study from Open the Book.
Yeah, so this is a very interesting report. And Open the Books has been like a kind of a longstanding, I think, accountability nonprofit. Then they're basically saying like, hey, this is what we found. We're looking at the finances. We're looking at these different kinds of things. But they basically, this report is on the Department of Defense Education Activity, the DODEA. This is the school system for families who are abroad in part of the Department of Defense, right? So there's a number of and you kind of don't think about it until you start thinking about it, like that. We have military families all over the world, and that the Department of Defense has to pay somebody to teach kids of military families, in Europe or in different parts of the globe, right? And so it's one of those. I've written about it before. There was a Government Accountability Office report on it, and basically that they were having too many standardized tests, and they kind of said if you need to have more input involved from different educational stakeholders. But they previously, there was I think a write-up in the New York Times that they're one of the best districts in the country according to standardized tests, right? That they're very high performance from students at these DODEA schools. So it is like a notable district and something that's worth looking into more. Open the Books essentially in this report says that the Department of Defense Education Activity is teaching staff and students what it calls extreme radical pedagogical practices under the umbrella of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So basically using DEI as, sort of a vehicle to have some of these radical ideas coming in. And basically they said, you can see in some of the FOIA requests that they've done, some of the content, that they're sort of injecting it with some of this radical ideology. So that's in a nutshell what the report is saying. It's a pretty lengthy report, and some of it is just, we know sort of how much we don't know, right? Like how the DODEA is not being forthcoming about stuff. So it's an interesting report, and it's, an interesting thing to try to say, okay, we have a school district here that, is not being forthcoming. It's not complying with FOIA laws. On the other side, it's an interesting thing to have a government run district instead of people electing a superintendent and sort of having a normal school district. This is still a school district, and students are in the balance here, right? Their education is in the balance here, but it's run by the federal government. So you kind of have that extra, maybe a layer of red tape that you might not be dealing with at the local level.
Like you said, there's some limits to what information they were able to access, but they do have some numbers for spending over the years. Can you get into that a little bit?
Yeah, so they say that the spending for grants, they found that increased from $20 million in 2020 to over $70 million in 2022. And that there were the salaries for all staff in the system was $1.3 billion in fiscal year 2022. And then kind of along with that is, a lot of school districts, you can go and say, hey, we'd like to have a spreadsheet of, who's making what. And they'll provide, here's the position, here's the name, here's what they make. And you can find this actually. There's a lot of websites that'll have government employee salaries by year. So you can, go to San Diego Public Schools. I'm just kind of picking something, San Diego Unified, pick something, and then you can find this special education teacher for the last 5 years, what they've made. And it's all publicly available, but not the case with the DODEA. And it says it won't make individual salary information public according to, this report. So it's those kinds of things. And a lot of that spending that they've tracked down, they do say could go to vendors. And again, like it could go to vendors who are maybe offering something that has like some of these radical agendas or have like some of this DEI stuff. And, like if you have you have like groups that are very critical, I don't think they can prove, because they don't have the actual content. Could be, proprietary, could just be that the DODEA is not turning that over. You can't necessarily prove that they're doing this. So you're kind of relying on like, here's how much money was exchanged. Here's what this organization has said before. And so you kind of have to fill in the blanks there and say like, they might be, providing some kind of questionable content to staff or to students. So like, when you go through the report, you can kind of see that.
And the DODEA reportedly told Congress last year it would no longer have a diversity, equity, and inclusion department. But there's, kind of a caveat to that. What did they have to say about that?
Yeah, so essentially the DODEA said, we're dismantling our DEI department, but then they secretly created a DEI steering committee, according to this report. And so they moved the DEI professionals into like less public roles, but they're still employed, according to this report. And basically they wouldn't answer any questions about this DEI steering committee and some of these other things. And specifically that kind of boiled down into like, we would like to have information about meetings of the DEI steering committee. And I think that the DODEA like redacted all of the information about the meeting. So they wouldn't offer anybody specifically in this report. It contends that the DODEA only released the chief operating officer and the chief academic officer, I believe, or a couple of those names. So you're not sure who's on this steering committee essentially and that's what the report is saying. And that, if you got these, FOIAs back, these Freedom of Information Act requests, that a lot of the stuff would be redacted. So basically they're saying that, we've asked for this information from the federal government for a school district and we're not getting that back. And there doesn't seem like there's a good reason. So they're taking a lot of issue with the federal government's approach in terms of transparency.
Well, Brendan, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.
Thanks to Eliana and Brendan for that update. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Joining me to dig into the U.S. national debt is PhD economist Dr. Orphe Divounguy. Dr. O, something that we don't often talk about is the cost of the debt that we incur to operate the federal government. I think it's an important thing for us to pause and to take a look at every so often. The Peter G. Peterson Foundation keeps a very close watch on this, and I know that this is data and analysis that you like to spend time with.
I think they do a great job. I think they do a fantastic job of keeping track of the country's fiscal challenges. And they just looked at the latest CBO projections, and it's mind blowing.
So let me lay that out. This is from the report on July 2nd. So, this is just recent information. The CBO projects that interest costs in 2024 will total $892 billion, a jump of 36% from the previous year, and following increases of 35 and 38% in each of the 2 years before that. So what does that mean to the person who's listening to us?
And let me start with, is this normal? Is it normal for the federal government to spend that kind of money, right, on interest? And basically, the interest cost depends on the size of the debt, but also the interest rate. And as interest rates remain high for longer, right, you see those yields on treasury yields remaining very high. The cost that the federal government pays on its debt also increases. Relative to the size of the economy, which I think is a good benchmark, interest rate costs would reach 3.4% of GDP in 2025 and could climb up to 4.1% of GDP by 2034. When you compare the cost relative to federal revenues, right? So like what we're spending as a share of our kind of what you could call income, revenue from collecting taxes and all that stuff, the federal government would have interest payments rise to 20.3% of federal revenues by 2025 exceeding the previous high of 18.4% set in 1991. Essentially, it hasn't been this high since 1991, right? And I will have everybody remember that after 1991, by the way, the only times that we've had these types of numbers, that we faced these types of numbers, were in times where the debt really increased a lot. Our fiscal deficits increased a lot because we were either in a recession or because we were at war or something like that, right? Or both. And basically, look, back in 1991, I would like everybody to remember that in the 90s, there was a real effort by the federal government, by the President of the United States and Congress to reduce the debt. And we got to a point where the administration at the time managed, right? The administration, with the help of Congress and everybody concerned about the debt, they managed to balance the government budget. And I think that was the highlight maybe of the Clinton presidency, right? But everybody really took to it. It was and made the effort, right? To make sure that we don't remain on what we thought at the time was an unsustainable path. Today, it's the opposite. Nobody seems to care that we're basically on this unsustainable debt path.
Let me, for the benefit of the people that are listening, let me try to articulate sort of, the amount of interest. And I'm going to pull from the Peterson Foundation's chart from 2023. But to put this into some kind of context of the amount of money that we're spending on interest on debt. Last year, in fiscal year 2023, interest cost on the national debt totaled $658 billion. Okay, so we're trending to be well above that this year, and if we come in at 892 per the CBO's estimate. In terms of other government spending, the amount that we're spending on interest, it dwarfs what we're spending on Medicaid. It dwarfs what we're spending on children. It is more than double what we're spending on veterans programs. It is a vast multiple of what we're spending on quote unquote international affairs.
8-9 times.
And natural resources and the environment, which is less than $100 billion a year. It's actually probably more like 40.
Yeah. So if you're concerned about things like climate change, if you're concerned about things like education spending, you have to be concerned that basically this amount of interest paid on debt is basically going to crowd out the spending on the things that actually matter to you and I.
I appreciate your thoughts as always, Dr. O. That'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. The Center Square Radio Hour is a production of America's Talking Network, produced by Eliana Cardodal. If you missed some of today's show, you can find it at americastalking.com. I'm Chris Krug, and on behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation, thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.